But at the end of the day, they have to create something and everyone's going to see it, and it's public as well. So for all those reasons, we disincentivize the reasons for cheating in the first place.
Hi there, I am Monica Burns, and welcome to the new Easy EdTech podcast episode. As a former New York City public school teacher and current EdTech consultant, I started this podcast in 2019 to share my favorite classroom tech integration tips and stories from my experiences. Each episode offers practical ideas for you to try, share, or save for later. Be sure to check out classtechtips.com/podcast for today's show notes and resources. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or another favorite podcast app, you'll find the show notes link in the description too. This episode is sponsored by my new free ebook on ChatGPT. It's called 60 Plus Must-Try ChatGPT Prompts for Teachers, and it's full of ideas that will save you oodles of time. To grab the free ebook, go to classtechtips.com/ChatGPTbook. That's my website, classtechtips.com, and add a /ChatGPTbook. You can also find the link in the description of this episode or by tapping on the free stuff button on my website, classtechtips.com. This week's episode is titled Uncheatable Assessments and the Role of Digital Storytelling in the Classroom with Michael Hernandez. And I'm really excited for you to hear from a fellow Apple Distinguished Educator, as well as another ISTE author on our growing list of ISTE authors here on the podcast. Today, we talk about the idea of uncheatable assessments, something that's come up a lot in conversations around artificial intelligence in the past few months. You'll hear about Michael's work in the classroom and his new book on digital storytelling too. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to chat with you about this big idea of digital projects, digital storytelling, uncheatable assessments. But before we dive in, can you share with us a little bit, what is your role in education? What does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, my name's Michael Hernandez, and I am a high school teacher in the Los Angeles area. And I've been teaching broadcast journalism, cinematic arts, photography, and graphic design for about 24 years now. So my daily day-to-day is never the same. It's really exciting. I switch between courses. And really what I think is most exciting about my day-to-day is that I get to work with teams of students who are all working on project-based learning assignments that they sort of develop themselves and follow their passions for. So it's really just being more of like a coach to help them ask good questions, to find good resources and sculpt their stories, and then publish those stories to an audience. So it's always really exciting. It's always different, and we have a lot of fun.
You know, as we're thinking today about all those things that are happening with your students, different types of projects that they're working on, you know, one of the terms we'll talk about is digital storytelling. Can you unpack this term for a listener who hasn't heard of this before or who hasn't dived into this idea of digital storytelling yet?
Yeah, I think it's funny that we have to put the word digital in front of storytelling because everything is digital now. I mean, we look at our phones for news about the world and our families and our friends. And so for me in the classroom, digital storytelling can mean anything from like a simple photograph that maybe gets marked up to a data visualization. I love infographics and, you know, analyzing data and math and what I call in my book, you know, painting by numbers, right? So you're actually creating an image based on data, all the way up to something complex like a video documentary. So with my students, a digital storytelling can be a range of stories. It can be an explainer video. It could be a podcast. It could be a digital book. They create their own digital portfolios that they keep with them once they graduate. So it can mean a whole variety of things. And we try to have the kids have experiences in multiple different media, so they become very familiar with it. And, you know, for me, I guess it's really important because that's how the world works. And I want to make sure that my kids are digitally literate. And the only way that you can really become digitally literate is by using and embracing and learning how those media work, both in terms of the construction of them, but also designing something for an audience that will be consumed. So what's the impact you want to have? Anyway, that's kind of a long rambling answer to your question, but that's how I would define digital storytelling.
I love those examples because it really does give us a sense of all the ways that we consume content, that we create content, and empowering kids to do all the things and all the different mediums that you mentioned. And so in your new book, you use the term uncheatable assessments. And this is something that I know a lot of people are talking about right now when it comes to the availability of generative AI or artificial intelligence tools. I've talked a lot about ChatGPT here on the podcast. Fellow Apple Distinguished Educator Richard Perry was on with me earlier this year talking about this in his classroom. So, how do digital storytelling projects help create uncheatable assessments, and how can this improve student learning outcomes?
Yeah. So, I've been thinking a lot about this with my own students and what teachers at my school are going through right now with AI. First of all, we have to think about, what do we mean by an assessment? What are we here to grade, right? Is it the system or is it the values? Like, is it the knowledge or the application of the knowledge, right? And so for me, it's the latter, right? I want to make sure that kids understand it by applying it. And so digital stories can actually help kids apply that knowledge. And so I think a lot of times people think digital storytelling is not for them because they teach science or history or math or something like that, right? But if you have an outcome that's sort of like a project-based learning model, and the kids are working towards completing that project because they care about it, because it's meaningful, it actually has purpose beyond the classroom. It won't be thrown away, at the end of the lesson or the unit. And so first of all, it instills in them this sense of purpose behind it. So they don't want to cheat because they care about the outcome of it. So we de-incentivize cheating that way. And then the other big piece as a teacher is that, it's not a common answer. If every student has the same answer or is expected to have the same outcome, of course it's cheatable. But because every story is unique, every story is different based on the student, the subject that they choose, how they choose to tell the story, the people that they interview, the shots that they take, the design of a slide, that's all unique and it can't be cheated. Now they could make up the research, they could fake the numbers, but at the end of the day, they have to create something and everyone's going to see it and it's public as well. So for all those reasons, we disincentivize the reasons for cheating in the first place because kids want to do the work. They want to have the outcome. There's a meaning and purpose behind it and everything's unique. So for me, I think it's a really easy thing to see here and everybody should be embracing it. I think it's a great option.
That's such a great reminder, Michael, about the different content areas that are here, right? This is not just in an English language arts classroom or in a social studies classroom, but you already shared a bit about, right, infographics, which might have a lot of data or research that's taking place that connect to a science concept. So there's so many directions teachers can go in when embracing this idea of uncheatable assessments, right? Especially if that's front of mind for them. So can you share some examples, maybe from your own work, from classrooms you visited, from schools and districts? I know you work with educators in different parts of the country, different parts of the world. Can you share some examples of successful digital storytelling projects from your work and the impact they've had on student learning and engagement?
Absolutely. And for me, one of my favorite classes is my broadcast journalism class. And I know a lot of folks don't teach quote unquote journalism, but in my book, I actually make a comparison that journalism is basically like science. And I call journalism STEM for the humanities, because it's basically, here's this problem that's out there that we're noticing, and we want to develop a solution for an end user. And in this case, it's our audience, right? And so the students are free to choose, issues in their communities or around the world that they feel need to be addressed or discussed or explored somehow. And so for me, some of the most exciting and powerful examples of success stories come from my journalism class. And this could be a documentary that you do as well. But basically, a really good example came from a documentary trip that we took to Cuba a few years ago. And one of my students was a sophomore at the time, so she was 15, produced this wonderful documentary while we were there, and she published it to her YouTube channel, her personal YouTube channel. And she came in one day and she says, "Mr. Hernandez, like, somebody left these really weird comments on my post and I don't know what to do." And I'm like, "Uh-oh, what happened?" So we looked at it, and there was somebody outside of my class and in the world who actually lived in Cuba. saw her video and critiqued it. He's like, you got it all wrong. You're coming in with this American perspective of, poverty in Cuba and the government, blah, 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 blah. And he went off on her. And he wasn't a troll. He wasn't being a bully. He was just very passionate about getting the facts right. And so she's like, what should I do? And I'm like, well, why don't you respond to him? Why don't you reply? And so she ended up having a conversation in the chat of her YouTube post with a real person in the real world, a stakeholder, someone that she had not met before, but had lived that life that she hadn't lived, and ended up in a much better place, a much bigger understanding of the politics and the economy and the cultural differences for someone who was living in another place. And for me, that hits on so many different levels of learning, right? So it's, how do I truly understand politics? How do I have empathy for other people and get outside my own head and my own community? Because face it, we're all sort of insulated in our small communities and our bubbles, right? And how can I engage in constructive dialogue with someone who has a difference of opinion? How can I engage in and understand constructive criticism, right? And take criticism, which I think is a really struggle for all of us, myself included. And so it's hitting on everything. It's not just the exact curriculum that I'm teaching, which is filmmaking. So I'm concerned about, is the camera in focus? Or the audio, right? And that's nothing. If you think about it, that's the least important part of it. The most important part is that experience that they have connecting with other people and how they learn to process ideas and how they learn to research and process and think differently moving forward. So for me, that's a success story. And that's why digital storytelling is so important.
And just the implications there, or, what can happen in any content area, all of that feedback, all of the critical thinking, right? Just the evaluation of different sources or where you're gathering information from. That's not something that's just in one domain, right? Or in one subject area. So, as someone's listening today and they might have a math teacher hat on or a media specialist hat on, right? Or coming from their specific background or their specific learning environment, what are some practical strategies for educators who want to implement digital storytelling projects in their classroom? They love this idea of uncheatable assessments, but maybe they face some limitations such as time or resources or even administrative support. What are some strategies or tips that you would recommend for them to consider?
Yeah, digital storytelling can be very simple and easy, as simple as just taking a photograph and analyzing it, right? Documenting what you do, sharing different perspectives. And in my book, I actually have a whole section on quick, easy lessons that you can implement right away. So you don't really need a ton of time or technology to do it. So I would say start small, know what you're going for. What are your learning outcomes? What are the goals that you have? And I'd say focus on the content rather than on the technique so much. And that's a good way to start. I feel it's also tricky because I think we are not used to having a messy project. We want it to be quiet, right? We want the kids to sit down and just sit in their desks and everybody have the same answer, and learn to be comfortable with noise and movement and having everybody having a different outcome. I also feel it's really important to share in the learning too. So in my chapter on assessment, like how do we assess these kinds of stories, is to have, there's different levels of assessment. So there's the assessment I would give them personally with a note that's private to them. But I also feel there's value in sharing and having class critiques as well. So that's an easy thing to do. It takes a little bit of time, but when everybody can see everybody else's work, the students sort of elevate each other and they kind of get inspired by what other people are doing. Because we don't want to keep the learning secret. We want it to be public and learn from each other. So developing that culture of, shared discovery and curiosity, I think is really important. And that doesn't really cost anything other than a little bit of time.
And that's such a great reminder too, when we talk about creation or creativity, and the audience aspect of that, right? Who's going to see, who's going to celebrate that? You have that kind of built-in audience, right? And you might have students celebrating not just the final product, but being part of the process along the way, right? And we talk so much about the importance of feedback and community in a classroom. And it's such a great way to tie all of these goals together. So, Michael, you mentioned your book, which comes out later this year. I know it's available for pre-order now, and we'll include all the links where people are listening. But can you provide a brief overview of your book, Storytelling with Purpose, Digital Projects to Ignite Student Curiosity, and what inspired you to bring this to life, to write this book for educators?
Yeah, I mean, I've been teaching now for about 24 years, and I've learned that kids really want to engage the world and make an impact. And I feel like that's especially true of the world we live in right now, which can be a very confusing and complicated place. And I've also found that teachers and students, we just want to have fun, we want to enjoy learning and also be part of something meaningful. So I wrote this book to help educators sort of leverage students' natural sense of curiosity to energize their classrooms through student-created digital storytelling projects. And I feel that's important because we need to provide purpose for our curriculum. The pandemic sort of shone a light on that like, oh, we sort of reevaluated our lives to discover what really matters most to us. So the book really kind of builds on what teachers already do best. And so I just offer advice and classroom tested activities that I've used myself to integrate these project-based learning story challenges in every subject area and grade level, right? So I just, like we were saying before, engaging work is always better than tests, and we want to really connect our curriculum to our communities and help students make connections between their own lives and our curriculum and across different disciplines too. So I feel it's the right book at the right time, and it's actually been a book 24 years in the making.
Yeah. Well, this is such a great conversation, Michael, around all the things that we know are so important, right? Checking for understanding, embracing curiosity and creativity. And I'm going to link out so everyone can connect with you and find your new book and the pre-order page and all of those great things. But for anyone who's maybe on the go and listening in, can you let us know, where can people connect with you? Where can they learn more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am on Instagram at changing.the.narrative. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can just search for me, Michael Hernandez. I'm on Twitter as well. So really excited to share the book with everybody when it comes out, and really appreciate having this conversation. It's been really fun, Monica.
Thank you so much for your time today, for your insights. Really appreciate you chatting with me. It was lots of fun chatting with Michael today around a topic that I know is front of mind for so many educators. When it comes to uncheatable assessments and the role of digital storytelling in the classroom, there are lots of directions you can take it in. So let's make this EdTech easy with a few key points from the episode. Keep it simple. Start small and low tech. Focus on content. And provide purpose for your curriculum. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from today's episode, including all the ways to connect with Michael Hernandez, at classtechtips.com/podcast, and finding today's episode number 214. This episode is sponsored by my new free ebook on ChatGPT. It's called 60 Plus Must-Try ChatGPT Prompts for Teachers, and it's full of ideas that will save you oodles of time. To grab the free ebook, go to classtechtips.com/ChatGPT-book. That's my website, classtechtips.com, and add a /ChatGPT-book. You can also find the link in the description of this episode or by tapping on the free stuff button on my website, classtechtips.com. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday edition of the Easy EdTech podcast. Remember to hit follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite app to have next week's episode ready for you on Tuesday morning. Feel free to share takeaways from this episode with friends or colleagues in a quick email or text, or even on social media. And don't hesitate to tag me at Class Tech Tips if you have any questions.